The blood-red sunset painted the dusty main street of Clifton, Arizona Territory. 1878, as Delilah Grayson struggled against the ropes binding her wrists, the weathered wooden auction platform beneath her feet creaking with each desperate movement. Her father's last cruel act, selling his own daughter to settle a gambling debt, had left her standing before a crowd of leering men, her chestnut hair falling across tear-stained cheeks as the auctioneer's voice rang out across the gathered crowd. $500 for the prettiest filly this side of the Mississippi. Do I hear $6? Delilah closed her eyes, unable to bear the humiliation any longer. At 22, she'd spent years caring for her father after her mother's death, only to be betrayed when his vices finally consumed him completely. She'd heard whispers of such things happening to unfortunate women in the untamed West, but never imagined she would become one of them. The sound of spurs jangling cut through the cacophony of shouts as a tall figure pushed through the crowd. Preston Abernathy sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders squared beneath a dust-covered duster, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. At 30, he'd made a name for himself as one of the most successful cattle ranchers in the territory, though few knew the man behind the reputation. $1,000, he called out, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced the crowd instantly. The auctioneer's eyes widened. 1,000 going once, going twice, she ain't for sale. Preston dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he approached the platform. This ain't right and everyone here knows it. The debt's legal, Abernathy, called Silas Jenkins, the saloon owner and gambling den proprietor who held Delilah's father's markers. Old man Grayson knew what he was signing away. Preston's jaw tightened. I said she ain't for sale. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it to Jenkins. There's $1,200. That covers whatever her worthless father owed you, and then some. The crowd murmured as Preston climbed the steps to the platform and approached Delilah. She flinched as his hands moved toward her, but he only untied the ropes binding her wrists. Miss Grayson, he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, I ain't buying you, I'm setting you free. Confusion clouded Delilah's tear-stained face. Why would you help me? Because no person should be sold like cattle. His eyes, a clear blue like the Arizona sky after a rain, met hers. My ranch is 5 miles east of town. If you need somewhere to stay until you figure things out, there's a spare room in the main house. Delilah rubbed her raw wrists, acutely aware of the stares from the dispersing crowd. How do I know your intentions are honorable, Mr. Abernathy? A hint of a smile touched his weather-worn face. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, would tan my hide if they weren't. She's been looking after me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. He offered his hand. What do you say? It's getting dark, and Clifton ain't kind to folks without a roof. With nowhere else to turn and night falling fast over the unforgiving desert, Delilah placed her trembling hand in his. I accept your offer, Mr. Abernathy, but only until I can find proper work. Fair enough. He helped her down from the platform, the touch of his calloused hand surprisingly gentle against her skin. My horse is tied up outside the general store. As they walked down the dusty main street, whispers followed them like shadows. Delilah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, shame burning her cheeks. Ignore them, Preston said. Talk dies down eventually. Not in Clifton, she replied bitterly. I've lived here my whole life. I'll always be the woman who was sold at auction. Preston stopped walking and turned to face her. Then, maybe Clifton ain't where you need to be anymore. He gestured toward the open desert beyond the town limits. Sometimes the only way forward is to leave the past behind. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, as Preston's horse carried them toward his ranch. Delilah sat behind him, her hands tentatively resting on his waist, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats matching her heartbeat. The vast openness of the Arizona territory stretched before them, beautiful, dangerous, and filled with possibility. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "No need," Preston replied, his words carried back to her. "What your father did, it wasn't right. You spent a fortune to help a stranger." Preston was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My mother was sold when she was barely older than you. Different circumstances, but the same humiliation. No one stepped in to help her." Delilah tightened her grip slightly. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said. "But some things a man doesn't forget." The Abernathy ranch appeared as they crested a hill, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, grazing cattle. Lamplight spilled from the windows, creating a warm glow against the darkening sky. As they approached, a woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on an apron. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined with age but her posture straight as a rail. "Preston Abernathy, you're late for supper again," she called, then stopped short at the sight of Delilah. "And who might this be?" Preston helped Delilah dismount before answering. "Mrs. Winters, this is Miss Delilah Grayson. She'll be staying with us for a spell." His eyes met the older woman's, communicating something unspoken. "She's had a difficult day." Understanding softened Mrs. Winters' expression. "Well then, come inside, dear. A hot meal and a warm bed will do wonders." She took Delilah's arm gently. "I've just made fresh biscuits, and there's beef stew enough for an army." The interior of the house surprised Delilah. It was spacious but comfortable, with solid furniture and shelves lined with books. Not the rough bachelor quarters she had expected, but a true home. "You can take the room at the top of the stairs, first door on the right," Mrs. Winters instructed. "There should be a nightgown in the dresser that might fit you. It belonged to Preston's sister before she married and moved to California." "I don't want to impose," Delilah began. "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted. "Now go wash up while I set another place at the table." Alone in the guest room, Delilah sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment to process everything that had happened. That morning, she had been preparing breakfast in the small house she shared with her father. Now, her entire world had been upended. She washed her face in the basin, changed into the borrowed nightgown, and wrapped a shawl she found in the wardrobe around her shoulders before heading downstairs. The voices of Preston and Mrs. Winters drifted from the dining room. "Couldn't just leave her there, Martha," Preston was saying. "I'm not faulting you for helping the girl," Mrs. Winters replied. "Lord knows someone needed to step in. I'm just saying people will talk. Let them." "Wouldn't be the first time." Delilah hesitated in the hallway, uncomfortable at overhearing their conversation. "The poor thing," Mrs. Winters continued. "Her mother was a good woman, should have seen how that girl tended to her when the consumption took hold. Then to have a father who'd sell his own daughter. She doesn't need our pity," Preston interrupted. "She needs a chance to stand on her own 2 feet again." Delilah cleared her throat as she entered the dining room. Both Preston and Mrs. Winters looked up, the latter with a warm smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "Come sit, dear. You must be famished." Throughout the meal, Delilah found herself studying Preston when he wasn't looking. In the lamplight, she could see details she'd missed before: a scar that ran along his jawline, the laugh lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled more than his serious demeanor indicated, the way his hands, though rough from work, moved with precision when cutting his food. "I can work," Delilah said suddenly, breaking a lengthy silence. I'm a good cook and I can sew. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Abernathy. I won't be a charity case." Preston met her gaze steadily. "There's plenty of work to be done around here. Mrs. Winters could use help with the house, and we've got hands coming in for the spring roundup who'll need feeding." "That's settled then," Mrs. Winters said with satisfaction. "You'll help me with the cooking and housekeeping, and we'll set aside wages for you. Every woman needs her own money, especially these days." After dinner, Delilah insisted on helping with the dishes despite Mrs. Winters' protests. The familiar task gave her hands something to do while her mind raced with plans for the future. "He's a good man," Mrs. Winters said as they worked side by side. "Stubborn as a mule and about as talkative, but a good man nonetheless." "Why isn't he married?" Delilah asked before she could stop herself. Mrs. Winters glanced toward the study where Preston had retreated with a ledger. "There was a girl, years back. Emily Thornton. They were to be married, but she took fever during a harsh winter, hit him hard." She handed Delilah a plate to dry. "He's focused on building the ranch ever since. Some men bury their hearts along with their past." Later that night, Delilah stood by the window of her borrowed room, gazing out at the vast expanse of stars above the ranch. The events of the day seemed like a terrible nightmare, yet the ache in her chest reminded her it had all been horribly real. Her father, the only family she had left in the world, had sold her to cover a gambling debt. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes. A movement below caught her attention. Preston stood on the porch, smoking a cigarette, his face illuminated briefly by the match he struck. In profile, against the backdrop of the moonlit desert, he looked almost like a figure from one of the dime novels that occasionally made their way to Clifton, the lone hero, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Except this wasn't a story, and Delilah wasn't sure if heroes truly existed. What she did know was that Preston Abernathy had saved her from a fate worse than death, asking nothing in return except that she help with the work that needed doing. For now, that would have to be enough. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that brought an unexpected comfort to Delilah's life. She rose before dawn each day to help Mrs. Winters prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. The work was hard but satisfying, baking bread, mending clothes, tending the kitchen garden that provided fresh vegetables for their meals. Preston was often gone from sunup to sundown, returning with the dust of the range clinging to his clothes and a weariness that spoke of honest work. He rarely said much at dinner, but his eyes would often find Delilah's across the table, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. One evening in late April, nearly a month after Delilah's arrival at the ranch, she found herself alone in the kitchen when Preston entered through the back door. The ranch hands had finished their meal and departed for the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Winters had retired early with a headache. "Something smells good," Preston said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Delilah looked up from the apple pie she was removing from the oven. "Mrs. Winters taught me her recipe. I thought it might be nice for dessert. She guards that recipe like a miser with his gold." A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "You must have made quite an impression." Delilah set the pie on the windowsill to cool. "She's been very kind to me." She hesitated before adding, "Everyone here has." Preston washed his hands in the basin, the muscles in his forearms flexing with the movement. "It's not kindness to treat folks decent. It's just the way things ought to be. Not everyone sees it that way." Delilah busied herself with wiping down the countertop, avoiding his gaze. "I received a letter from town today. Apparently, my father's house has been seized to cover his remaining debts." Preston dried his hands on a towel. "I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. There was nothing there I need." She forced a lightness into her voice she didn't feel. "Besides, Mrs. Winters says I'm making myself useful here. More than useful. Preston leaned against the counter. The men haven't eaten this well in years. A comfortable silence fell between them as Delilah served him a plate of the stew she'd kept warming. She'd noticed he preferred to eat later after the chaos of the communal meal had subsided. "I've been meaning to ask," he said after several bites. "Do you ride?" The question surprised her. "Not since I was a girl. My mother taught me, but after she passed." She shrugged. "There wasn't time for such things. There's a mare in the stable that needs exercise, gentle temperament good for getting back in the saddle." He looked up from his plate. "If you're interested." The offer seemed to contain more than just the loan of a horse. It felt like an invitation to reclaim a piece of herself she'd lost. "I'd like that," she said softly. The next afternoon, Preston met her by the corral, leading a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. Delilah wore a borrowed riding skirt from Mrs. Winters, who had insisted on altering it the previous evening. "This is Penny," Preston said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's the gentlest horse on the ranch, but she's got spirit when you need it." Delilah approached slowly, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. "She's beautiful, beauty and practicality. Can't ask for more than that." Preston watched as the mare nuzzled Delilah's palm. "She likes you already." With his help, Delilah mounted, muscle memory returning as she adjusted her seat in the saddle. Preston swung up onto his own horse, a powerful black stallion that dwarfed Penny. "We'll start slow," he said, guiding his mount alongside hers. "Follow the trail along the creek. It's pretty this time of year." They rode in companionable silence, the only sounds the creaking of leather saddles and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush. The creek, a silver ribbon winding through the valley below. "My mother loved to ride," Delilah said, memories surfacing that she'd kept locked away for years. "She said it was the closest thing to freedom a woman could find." Preston nodded. "Smart woman. She would have liked it here." The realization came unbidden, along with the ache of knowing her mother would never see this place, never know the kindness these people had shown her daughter. "What about you?" Preston asked. "Do you like it here?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "I do," she admitted. "More than I expected to." "Good." He adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes from the late afternoon sun. "Because the offer stands as long as you wanted a place here, work that needs doing, fair wages for it." Delilah reined Penny to a stop, forcing Preston to circle back to her. "Why are you being so good to me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "When I first saw you on that auction block, I was angry, not at you, at a world that would allow such a thing to happen." He shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable with speaking so openly. "But then I saw how you held yourself. Dignity, even in that moment. It reminded me that sometimes all a person needs is a chance to prove their worth." "And have I proved my worth?" The corner of his mouth lifted in a rare smile. "You've more than earned your keep, Miss Grayson." "But that's not what I mean." He gestured to the expansive landscape around them. "Out here, a person's worth isn't measured by their past or what others say about them. It's in how they face each day, how they treat others, how they handle whatever comes their way." Delilah felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. "I never thought I'd thank my father for anything again, but if he hadn't—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. "If he hadn't been a sorry excuse for a man, you wouldn't have ended up here." Preston finished for her, a hint of amusement in his voice. She laughed, surprised by his bluntness. "Something like that. Life has strange ways of leading us where we need to go," he said, his voice softening, "even when the path seems cruel at the time." As they turned their horses back toward the ranch, the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. Delilah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Perhaps Preston was right, perhaps this was exactly where she needed to be. The spring roundup arrived with a flurry of activity that transformed the normally quiet ranch into a hive of constant motion. Additional hands were hired, cattle were gathered from the far reaches of Preston's land, and the kitchen became Delilah's domain as she and Mrs. Winters worked from before dawn until well after dusk to feed the hungry men. On the third night of the roundup, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing with it driving rain and wind that howled around the corners of the house. The ranch hands had taken shelter in the bunkhouse, leaving only Preston, Delilah, and Mrs. Winters in the main house. "This'll slow things down," Mrs. Winters observed as she knitted by the fire in the sitting room. "The arroyos will be flooded by morning." Delilah glanced out the window at the sheets of rain illuminated by flashes of lightning. "Will the cattle be all right? They'll find high ground," Preston said, entering the room with a stack of ledgers under his arm. "It's the men I'm worried about. They'll be climbing the walls with nothing to do but play cards and tell tall tales." "More mouths to feed either way," Mrs. Winters said, setting aside her knitting with a yawn. "I think I'll turn in early. These old bones can feel the weather changing." After the older woman had gone upstairs, an unusual silence fell over the room. It was rare for Delilah and Preston to find themselves alone together, especially in the evening hours. "Would you like me to make some coffee?" Delilah offered, suddenly conscious of how the firelight cast shadows across Preston's face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw. "That would be welcome," he replied, settling into the chair Mrs. Winters had vacated. "These figures aren't making sense, and I suspect it'll be a long night." In the kitchen, Delilah busied herself with preparing the coffee, grateful for the familiar task to occupy her hands. Over the weeks, her feelings toward Preston had evolved from gratitude to respect, and lately, something deeper that she hesitated to name. She'd caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way he spoke gently to even the most stubborn horse, how he treated every man who worked for him with respect, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. When she returned with 2 steaming cups, she found him standing by the window, watching the storm. "My father used to say that rain in these parts was God's way of reminding us that even the driest ground can bloom again," she said, offering him a cup. Preston accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Wise words. The only wise thing he ever said, I suspect." She sat in the chair opposite his. "He wasn't always what he became. When my mother was alive, he was different." "Grief changes people," Preston said, returning to his seat. "Sometimes it brings out the best in them, sometimes the worst." "Is that what happened to you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that was a fair question," he interrupted, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. "Mrs. Winters told you about Emily." It wasn't a question, but Delilah nodded anyway. She mentioned there had been someone. Preston was quiet for so long that Delilah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the sound of the rain. "When Emily died, I wanted to die too. For a while I tried my best to make that happen, took risks no sane man would, pushed myself beyond endurance." He stared into the fire. "One night I rode out during a storm worse than this one. Horse threw me miles from anywhere. I lay there with a broken leg, rain pouring down, thinking this was it." "What happened?" Delilah asked softly. "Mrs. Winters sent out search parties when I didn't come back. Found me half drowned in mud, more dead than alive." A rueful smile touched his lips. "She sat by my bedside for 3 days, alternating between nursing me and lecturing me about throwing away the life God gave me. She loves you very much." like the son she never had. Preston met her gaze across the space between them. She made me see that honoring Emily's memory meant living well, not following her to the grave. Delilah felt the weight of his trust in sharing such a personal story. And now, have you found peace with it, most days? He set aside his empty coffee cup. What about you? Have you found peace with what your father did? The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure. Sometimes I'm still angry, other times I just feel sad for him, for what he became. She twisted her hands in her lap. Is it strange that part of me still loves him despite everything? No, Preston said simply. Love isn't something you can just switch off, even when someone hurts you. A crack of thunder shook the house, causing Delilah to jump slightly. Preston rose and added another log to the fire. If you're planning to stay up while I work on these books, I should warn you I'm poor company when wrestling with numbers, he said, changing the subject. Delilah smiled. I don't mind. I thought I might work on mending that shirt of yours, the blue one with the torn sleeve. They settled into a comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own task, yet acutely aware of the other's presence. The storm raged outside, but within the warm circle of firelight, Delilah felt a sense of belonging she'd almost forgotten was possible. As the weeks passed, the ranch settled back into its regular rhythm after the roundup. The long days of summer brought a new intensity to the landscape heat that shimmered above the distant hills, sudden afternoon thunderstorms that vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving the air smelling of rain and sage. Delilah found herself looking forward to her daily rides with Preston, which had become a regular occurrence. Though they often rode in silence, there was a comfort in his company that required no words. Sometimes, when they stopped to rest the horses by the creek, he would point out a hawk circling overhead or the tracks of a deer in the soft mud by the water's edge, sharing his knowledge of the land with a quiet enthusiasm that made her see her surroundings through new eyes. It was during one such ride in late June that they encountered trouble. They had ventured farther than usual, following the creek to where it widened into a small pond surrounded by cottonwoods. As they watered their horses, the sound of approaching riders made Preston straighten, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle in his saddle holster. 3 men appeared from between the trees, their horses lathered with sweat. Delilah immediately recognized the man in the lead, Victor Harmon, a wealthy rancher whose property bordered Preston's to the north. She'd seen him in town often enough to know his reputation for ruthlessness in business and pleasure. Abernathy, Harmon called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that set Delilah's nerves on edge. Bit far from your usual range, aren't you, Harmon? Preston's acknowledgement was cool but polite, just giving the horses some exercise. Harmon's gaze shifted to Delilah, a slow smile spreading across his face that made her skin crawl. And who's this lovely creature? Don't believe we've been properly introduced. Before Preston could respond, one of Harmon's companions leaned forward in his saddle. That's the Grayson girl, boss. The one old man Grayson tried to sell to settle his debts. Heat flooded Delilah's cheeks at the reminder of that terrible day. Preston moved his horse slightly, positioning himself between her and the men. Miss Grayson works for me, he said, his voice carrying a warning. And we need to be heading back. Harmon made no move to let them pass. Word in town is she's doing more than working for you, Abernathy. His eyes raked over Delilah again. Can't say I blame you. If I'd known she was on the block, might have made a bid myself. Delilah saw Preston's knuckles whiten on his reins, the only outward sign of his anger. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. You want to be careful about what you're implying, Harmon. The tension between the 2 men crackled like lightning before a storm. Delilah feared what might happen if it broke. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart, "we should start back. Mrs. Winters will be expecting us for dinner." Preston held Harmon's gaze for a moment longer before nodding slightly. "You're right, Miss Grayson." He guided his horse around Harmon's men. "Good day, gentlemen." They rode in silence until they were well out of earshot, the tension in Preston's shoulders visible even from behind. "I'm sorry," Delilah finally said. Preston reined his horse to a stop and turned to face her. "For what?" "For being the cause of that unpleasantness." Anger flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by concern. "You have nothing to apologize for. Harmon's a snake, always has been." "But he was right about one thing," she said quietly. "People are talking about us." Preston's expression softened. "People always talk. It doesn't matter what they say." "It matters to me," Delilah insisted. "I don't want my presence here to damage your reputation." "My reputation?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've never given a damn about that." "Well, I give a damn about mine," she retorted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "And I give a damn about yours too, whether you care or not." Something shifted in Preston's gaze, a realization, perhaps, or a decision made. He dismounted and approached her horse, reaching up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't release her waist immediately, his hands warm through the fabric of her riding dress. "Delilah," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Do you want to leave the ranch?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meanings. Did she want to leave? The thought of returning to Clifton, of facing the whispers and stares alone, made her stomach knot with dread. But more than that, the thought of leaving Preston, of not seeing him each day, created an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. "No," she admitted. "I don't want to leave." Relief softened his features. "Good, because I don't want you to go." The confession, simple as it was, changed something between them. Preston's hands remained at her waist, and Delilah found herself reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. "What are we doing, Preston?" she whispered. His eyes searched hers. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "All I know is that since you came to the ranch, things have been different, better." Before she could respond, the distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Preston looked up at the gathering clouds. "Storm's coming. We should get back." The ride home was silent, but charged with a new awareness that neither seemed ready to address. As they approached the ranch, Delilah noticed unusual activity. Several horses she didn't recognize were tied up outside, and Mrs. Winters stood on the porch, her expression tense. "Something's wrong," Preston muttered, spurring his horse faster. As they dismounted, Mrs. Winters hurried down the steps. "Preston, thank heavens you're back. The sheriff's here from Clifton and he's brought some men with him." Delilah felt her blood run cold. "The sheriff? Why, Mrs.?" Winters cast a worried glance at Delilah. "He says he's here about your father, dear. Apparently he's been found." Preston's hand found the small of Delilah's back, steadying her. "Found? I thought he'd left town after." He didn't finish the sentence. "He's dead," came a gruff voice from the doorway. Sheriff Taylor stood there, his weathered face grim beneath his mustache. "Found his body in an arroyo outside of town. Been there a while from the looks of it." Delilah swayed slightly, a rush of conflicting emotions washing over her: grief, shock, and a shameful hint of relief that she immediately tried to suppress. "How?" Preston asked, his arm moving to encircle Delilah's waist, supporting her. "Bullet to the head," the sheriff replied bluntly. "And before you ask, no, we don't think it was self-inflicted. Someone wanted Grayson dead." "What does this have to do with us?" Preston's voice had hardened. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Delilah. "We need to ask Miss Grayson some questions. She was the last person known to have seen him alive." "That's not true," Delilah protested, finding her voice. Silas Jenkins saw him after I did the day he. She couldn't bring herself to say it. The day he tried to sell you, Sheriff Taylor finished for her, his expression unreadable. Yes, Jenkins mentioned that. Quite a motive for murder, some might say. Preston stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Delilah. If you're implying what I think you are, you'd better have more than speculation, Taylor. The sheriff raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Abernathy, just following procedure. Miss Grayson was his daughter, after all. She has a right to know what happened, and we need her statement. Delilah placed a hand on Preston's arm. It's all right. I have nothing to hide. To the sheriff, she added, I'll answer any questions you have. Inside, the tension in the parlor was palpable as Delilah sat across from Sheriff Taylor, with Preston standing behind her chair like a sentinel. Two deputies remained near the door, their hands never straying far from their holsters. When was the last time you saw your father, Miss Grayson? The sheriff began, notebook open on his knee. The morning of April 2nd, Delilah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He left the house early, said he had business to attend to. And you had no idea what he was planning. She shook her head. If I had known he intended to sell me to cover his debts, I would have left town. The sheriff made a note. And after Mr. Abernathy intervened at the auction, did you have any contact with your father? No. I came directly to the ranch and have been here ever since. Can anyone verify your whereabouts for the past 3 months? Preston's hand came to rest on her shoulder. I can, he said firmly. As can Mrs. Winters and every hand on this ranch. Delilah hasn't left the property except in my company. Sheriff Taylor's gaze flickered between them, noting the protective gesture and Preston's use of her given name. I see. And what exactly is your arrangement here, Miss Grayson? The implication behind the question made Delilah's cheeks burn. I work for Mr. Abernathy as a housekeeper and cook, alongside Mrs. Winters. He pays me a fair wage for my labor. And you sleep where exactly? Before Delilah could answer, Preston cut in. That's enough, Taylor. Miss Grayson's living arrangements are none of your concern unless you're charging her with something. The sheriff closed his notebook with a snap. No charges at the moment, but I'll need you both to stay available for further questioning. He rose to his feet. Oh, and there's the matter of your father's effects, Miss Grayson. What little there was. You'll need to come into town to claim them. After the sheriff and his men had departed, Delilah sat motionless in the parlor, staring at the empty fireplace. The news of her father's death felt unreal, like something happening to someone else. Preston returned from seeing the sheriff out, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey and offering one to Delilah. She took it with trembling fingers, the amber liquid burning her throat as she swallowed. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. He was my father, but after what he did. Preston sat beside her on the settee. There's no right way to feel, Delilah. Grief isn't simple, especially when the person was complicated. She gave a bitter laugh. Complicated, that's one way to put it. She took another sip of whiskey. Do you think the sheriff suspects me? It's his job to suspect everyone, Preston replied. But he won't find anything because you didn't do anything, and I'll make damn sure he knows it. Delilah looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw that brooked no argument. In that moment, she realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with Preston Abernathy, this quiet, honorable man who had saved her from degradation and given her a chance at a new life. Thank you, she said softly, for standing by me. Again. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing. Always. The word hung in the air between them, a promise neither had expected to make or receive. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the valley. But inside, something else had broken the careful distance they had maintained, the pretense that what was growing between them was merely friendship or obligation. Preston's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. Delilah leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I shouldn't feel this way," she whispered. "Not now, not with everything that's happening." "The heart doesn't always choose convenient timing," Preston replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Believe me, I know." When his lips met hers, it was gentle, questioning a first kiss that asked permission even as it was given. Delilah answered by moving closer, her hand finding the front of his shirt, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring into a connection that felt both new and somehow inevitable. When they finally broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I didn't plan on this," he admitted. "When I brought you here, I never thought." "I know," Delilah said, understanding what he couldn't articulate. "I didn't either." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "What happens now?" It was a question with no simple answer, complicated by the shadow of her father's murder, the whispers in town, and the uncertainty of her position. But looking into Preston's eyes, Delilah found she didn't want simple answers anymore. "Now," she said, "we face whatever comes, together." The following morning brought clear skies, and the realization that decisions made in emotional moments must be reckoned with in the cold light of day. Delilah rose early, her mind racing with thoughts of her father's death, the sheriff's suspicions, and the kiss she had shared with Preston. She found Mrs. Winters already in the kitchen, kneading dough with more force than necessary. The older woman looked up as Delilah entered, her expression softening. "I made you some tea, dear. Thought you might need it after yesterday's news." Delilah accepted the offered cup gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters." "Martha," the older woman corrected. "I think it's time you called me Martha, don't you?" The simple offer of familiarity brought unexpected tears to Delilah's eyes. "I'd like that, Martha," the housekeeper nodded, resuming her kneading. "Preston rode out at dawn. Said he needed to check the south pasture, but I suspect he needed time to think." Heat rose to Delilah's cheeks. "Did he say anything about whatever happened between you two last night?" Martha's eyes twinkled with knowing. "He didn't have to. It was written all over his face." Delilah set down her teacup, suddenly anxious. "I don't know what to do, Martha. Everything is happening so fast, and now with my father's murder." "Life rarely waits for convenient timing," Martha said, echoing Preston's words from the night before. "All we can do is make the best decisions we can with what we know at the time." "And what do I know?" Delilah asked, more to herself than Martha. The older woman shaped the dough into a loaf before answering. "You know that Preston Abernathy is the best man I've ever known. And I think you know how he feels about you, even if he's too stubborn to say it plainly. And my father's death, the sheriff's suspicions," Martha's expression turned serious. "That's a different matter entirely. I won't lie to you, Delilah, there are people in town who think you had reason to want your father dead, and there are those who think Preston might have done it for you." The suggestion shocked Delilah. "Preston would never—" "I know that," Martha interrupted gently. "And you know that. But people will talk, especially when they don't have all the facts." "What facts?" "My father was killed after he tried to sell me. That's all anyone seems to care about." "Then perhaps it's time to find out what really happened," Martha suggested. "Not just for your sake or Preston's, but for the truth of it." The idea took root in Delilah's mind. If she wanted a future here, a future with Preston, she couldn't let suspicion hang over them. She needed answers about her father's death, no matter where they led. I need to go into town, she decided. The sheriff said I have to claim my father's effects anyway. Maybe there's something there that will help make sense of all this. Martha nodded approvingly. A sensible plan, but you shouldn't go alone. I'll ask Preston to accompany me when he returns. Good. Martha slid the bread into the oven. And while you're in town, you might want to visit Mabel Turner at the boarding house. She knew your father better than most. They were sweet on each other for a time before your mother came along. This was news to Delilah. I didn't know that. There's a lot about your father's past that might surprise you, Martha said cryptically. Mabel might be willing to share some of it, given the circumstances. When Preston returned around midday, Delilah was waiting for him on the porch. He dismounted slowly, his expression guarded but his eyes softening at the sight of her. You're looking better today, he said, climbing the steps to join her. I've had time to think, she replied. About my father, about us, about what needs to happen next. Preston removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. And what conclusions have you reached? I need to go into town, Delilah said, to collect my father's things and to find out what really happened to him. I'd like you to come with me if you're willing. Relief washed over his features. Of course I'll come. I was worried you might want to go alone, or worse, that you might be having second thoughts about. He gestured vaguely between them, unable to find the right words. Delilah stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. No second thoughts. Just a clear-eyed understanding that if we want any kind of future together, we need to resolve the past first. Preston covered her hand with his own. You're right, as usual. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. We'll go tomorrow. Best to face it head-on. The trip to Clifton the following day was tense but uneventful. Preston drove the wagon with Delilah seated beside him, her back straight and her chin held high despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. As they approached the outskirts of town, the familiar buildings brought a flood of memories, not all of them pleasant. Are you sure about this? Preston asked as they passed the church where Delilah had once attended services with her parents in happier times. No, she admitted. But it needs to be done. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, a small building on the main street with a weathered sign hanging above the door. Inside, Sheriff Taylor looked up from his desk with undisguised surprise. Miss Grayson, Abernathy, wasn't expecting to see you quite so soon. I've come to collect my father's effects, Delilah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The sheriff nodded, opening a drawer and removing a small cloth bundle. Not much, I'm afraid. The money he got from Jenkins was gone, either spent or stolen after he was killed. Delilah unwrapped the bundle on the sheriff's desk. Inside was her father's pocket watch, a family heirloom that had belonged to her grandfather, a worn leather wallet containing a faded photograph of her mother, and a folded piece of paper. What's this? She asked, picking up the paper. Don't know, the sheriff replied. Was in his pocket when we found him. Some kind of letter, looks like. Delilah unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle from exposure to the elements. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not her father's uneven scrawl, but a neat, educated script. Meet me at the usual place. Midnight. Come alone or the girl pays the price, she read aloud, her voice faltering on the last words. What girl? Me, Sheriff Taylor leaned forward. That's what I've been wondering. Thought it might be referring to you, but the timing doesn't make sense. This note was dated 2 days after the auction. Preston, who had been standing silently behind Delilah, spoke up. Who knew your father well enough to have a usual place to meet? Silas Jenkins, I suppose, Delilah said slowly. They gambled together for years. Jenkins claims he hadn't seen your father since the auction, the sheriff interjected. Says Grayson left town right after, ashamed of what he'd done. My father wasn't capable of shame, Delilah said bitterly. Not by then. Preston placed a hand on her shoulder. What about enemies? Did your father have any? Only the ones he made at the card table, she replied. But Mrs. Winters mentioned someone who might know more, Mabel Turner at the boarding house. Sheriff Taylor's eyebrows rose slightly. Mabel and your father were close once, years back. Might be worth talking to her. After gathering her father's meager possessions, Delilah and Preston made their way to the boarding house at the end of the main street. The two-story building had seen better days, its paint peeling and its porch sagging slightly, but it was clean and well-maintained. Mabel Turner herself answered the door, a tall, angular woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and shrewd eyes that widened at the sight of Delilah. Good heavens, child, you're the spitting image of your mother. She stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. I heard about Thomas, a terrible thing. Inside, Mabel led them to a small sitting room off the main hallway, offering tea that Delilah politely declined. Mrs. Winters, Martha suggested I speak with you, Delilah said once they were seated. She thought you might know something about my father that could help explain what happened to him. Mabel's expression grew guarded. Martha Winters always did have a nose for secrets. She studied Delilah for a long moment before continuing. Your father and I were close once, before he met your mother. Martha mentioned that. What she probably didn't mention was that your father had another life before he settled in Clifton. Mabel glanced at Preston, as if assessing whether she should speak freely in front of him. Anything you can tell me would be helpful, Delilah encouraged. And Preston has my complete trust. Mabel nodded slowly. Very well. Your father wasn't always Thomas Grayson. He came to Arizona Territory in '58 under a different name, Thomas Greenwood. He was running from something back east, though he never told me exactly what. The revelation stunned Delilah. He changed his name, and his past along with it, Mabel confirmed. When he met your mother, he was trying to start fresh. For a time, I believe he succeeded. Until my mother died, Delilah said softly, pieces falling into place. After that, he started drinking again, gambling, falling back into old habits, Mabel agreed, but worse than before. The last few years, I hardly recognized the man he'd become. Preston leaned forward. Mrs. Turner, do you have any idea who might have wanted Thomas dead? Mabel hesitated. A few weeks before what happened with Delilah, Thomas came to see me. He was scared, said someone from his past had found him. Did he say who? Delilah pressed. No names, but he mentioned Philadelphia, said it had to do with something that happened there 20 years ago. Philadelphia, Preston repeated. That's a long way from Arizona. Indeed, Mabel said grimly, which makes whoever came looking for him very determined. As they left the boarding house, Delilah's mind was reeling with this new information about her father. The man she had known or thought she had known was becoming a stranger with each revelation. We should speak to Silas Jenkins, Preston suggested as they walked back toward the main street. If anyone knows who your father might have been meeting, it would be him. The saloon was relatively quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few patrons scattered at tables. Silas Jenkins stood behind the bar, his expansive girth straining the buttons of his vest. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Delilah and Preston. Well, the prodigal daughter returns, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Come to settle your father's outstanding debts. Preston's hand moved to Delilah's back, a subtle reminder of his presence. We're here for information, Jenkins, not trouble, Jenkins snorted. Information costs, Abernathy, just like everything else in this world. Preston placed a gold coin on the bar. Consider this a down payment on your cooperation. The saloon owner's thick fingers closed over the coin. What do you want to know? Delilah produced the note found in her father's pocket. Do you know anything about this, or where his usual place might be? Jenkins read the note, his expression giving nothing away. Could be referring to the old line shack out by Rattlesnake Creek. Thomas used it sometimes when he needed to. Disappear for a while. Disappear from what? Delilah asked. From whom, more like, Jenkins corrected. Your father had a talent for making powerful enemies. Recently, there was a man asking about him, well-dressed fellow with an Eastern accent. Said he was an old business associate. Did he give a name? Preston pressed. Called himself Harrison. Charles Harrison. Jenkins shrugged. Seemed mighty interested in finding your father, Miss Grayson. Offered a substantial reward for information on his whereabouts. Delilah exchanged a glance with Preston. And did you tell this Mr. Harrison where to find my father? A flicker of unease crossed Jenkins' face. I might have mentioned the line shack. For the right price, of course. When was this? Few days after the auction. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. You thinking this Harrison fellow had something to do with Thomas turning up dead? It's a possibility, Preston said noncommittally. Where can we find this line shack? After getting directions from Jenkins, Delilah and Preston left the saloon, both lost in thought. Do you think this Harrison person killed my father? Delilah asked as they walked back to where they'd left the wagon. It's looking likely, Preston replied. Question is, why? What could your father have done in Philadelphia 20 years ago that would lead someone to track him all the way to Arizona territory for revenge? I don't know, Delilah admitted, but I think we need to find out, for both our sakes. As they prepared to return to the ranch, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A group of men had gathered outside the bank, their voices raised in argument. Among them, Delilah recognized Victor Harmon, his face flushed with anger as he jabbed a finger at a well-dressed stranger. That must be him, Preston murmured, steering Delilah toward the disturbance. The man in the fancy suit bet that's Charles Harrison. As they drew closer, they could make out the heated exchange. You had no right to interfere in my business dealings, Harmon was saying, his voice carrying across the street. This is my territory, and I don't take kindly to outsiders trying to change the established order. The stranger Harrison presumably remained calm in the face of Harmon's anger. Mr. Harmon, I assure you my business here is purely personal. I have no interest in your enterprises. Personal, my ass, Harmon spat. You've been asking questions all over town, buying up debts, stirring up trouble. Harrison's gaze drifted past Harmon, landing on Delilah and Preston with a flash of recognition that sent a chill down Delilah's spine. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Miss Grayson, I presume, he said, stepping around Harmon as if the rancher had ceased to exist. I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. Preston moved slightly in front of Delilah. And you are Charles Harrison of Harrison Banking and Trust, Philadelphia. The man extended a hand that Preston did not take. Unfazed, Harrison continued, I knew your father, Miss Grayson, or should I say I knew Thomas Greenwood. You're the one who's been looking for him, Delilah said, finding her voice. Did you kill him? Harrison's expression registered genuine surprise. Kill him? Good heavens, no. I wanted to find him, yes, but not to harm him. Quite the contrary, in fact. Then why track him all the way to Arizona? Preston demanded. To deliver news, Harrison replied, and to right an old wrong. He glanced around at the curious onlookers that had gathered. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. Delilah hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger who had appeared in the wake of her father's death. But curiosity and the need for answers outweighed her caution. We can talk at the hotel, she decided. In the dining room where there are people nearby. Harrison nodded. A sensible precaution, Miss Grayson. Lead the way. In the hotel dining room, they secured a corner table away from the few other patrons. Harrison ordered coffee for all of them before getting to the heart of the matter. Your father, Thomas Greenwood, worked for my father's bank in Philadelphia from 1855 to 1858, he began. He was a promising young accountant, well liked by everyone, including my sister, Elizabeth. Delilah's grip tightened on her coffee cup. Your sister? Harrison's expression softened. They were in love, secretly engaged, in fact. My father would never have approved. Thomas was from a humble background and the Harrisons were. Well, let's say we were conscious of our social standing. What happened? Preston asked, his voice betraying his interest despite his wariness. In the spring of 1858, a significant sum of money went missing from the bank. All evidence pointed to Thomas. He disappeared the same night, seemingly confirming his guilt. Harrison paused. My sister was devastated. She maintained his innocence until the day she died. And when was that? Delilah asked, a knot forming in her stomach. 3 years ago, Harrison replied. On her deathbed, she made me promise to find Thomas to tell him she had never stopped loving him, never stopped believing in him. The revelation hung in the air between them. Delilah tried to reconcile this story with the father she had known, the man who had loved her mother, who had once been kind before grief and addiction, twisted him into someone unrecognizable. There's more, Harrison continued after a moment. 6 months ago, we discovered that the true thief was my father's business partner, Gerald Withers. He had embezzled funds for years and framed your father when the discrepancies were about to be discovered. So my father was innocent, Delilah said slowly. All these years he was running from a crime he didn't commit. Yes. Harrison reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. When I finally tracked him here, it was to deliver this, a letter from Elizabeth, written before she died, and to tell him that his name had been cleared. That he could come home if he wished. But someone killed him before you could deliver the message, Preston said grimly. Harrison nodded. It appears so. When I heard of his death, I was devastated. I had failed in my promise to my sister. You mentioned righting an old wrong, Delilah reminded him. What did you mean? The money that was stolen, my family has set it aside with interest for Thomas. In the absence of Thomas, it rightfully belongs to his heir. Harrison slid the envelope across the table. You, Miss Grayson. Delilah stared at the envelope, unable to process what she was hearing. I don't understand. Inside is a bank draft for $20,000, along with documentation of your father's exoneration. Harrison's expression was solemn. It won't bring him back, but perhaps it can give you a fresh start. $20,000. The sum was staggering more money than Delilah had ever imagined possessing. It could change everything, open doors she had never dreamed of. And if my father had lived? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What would have happened then? He would have had a choice, Harrison replied. Return to Philadelphia with his name restored or remain here with his new identity. Either way, the money was his by right. Preston, who had been silent for several moments, finally spoke. This still doesn't explain who killed him or why. Harrison's expression darkened. I have a theory about that. When I arrived in Clifton, I began asking questions about Thomas. It didn't take long to discover that he owed money to several people, most notably Silas Jenkins and Victor Harmon. Harmon, Delilah repeated, remembering the confrontation they had witnessed earlier. My father owed money to Victor Harmon, significant sums from what I gathered. Harmon had threatened to foreclose on your home. Harrison's gaze was sympathetic. I suspect that's why your father did what he did, trying to sell you to cover his debts to Jenkins, hoping to buy time with Harmon. The pieces began to fall into place in Delilah's, mined her father's increasing desperation in the weeks before the auction. His muttered conversations with unseen visitors, the way he would jump at unexpected sounds. When I arrived, I began buying up your father's debts, Harrison continued. Including those held by Harmon, he was displeased to say the least. Displeased enough to kill? Preston asked. Harmon has a reputation for violence when his interests are threatened, Harrison confirmed. And if he learned that Thomas was about to come into money, he might have decided to eliminate the middleman, Preston finished grimly. Take Thomas out of the equation entirely. Delilah stood abruptly, the realization hitting her with physical force. The note, meet me at the usual place. Midnight. Come alone or the girl pays the price. It wasn't about me at all. It was about Elizabeth. Harrison looked startled. What note? She explained about the paper found in her father's pocket, watching understanding dawn on Harrison's face. Someone knew about Elizabeth, he said slowly. Someone used his past to lure him to his death. Harmon, Preston said with certainty. He must have gotten the information from you, Harrison. Not directly, Harrison protested, but I did make inquiries. I may have mentioned Elizabeth to someone in town. Jenkins, Delilah said, the pieces falling into place. You asked Silas Jenkins about my father, and Jenkins works for Harmon. Everyone knows that. Preston stood, his expression hardening. We need to take this to the sheriff. Now. The confrontation at the sheriff's office was tense but productive. With Harrison's testimony and the evidence of the note, Sheriff Taylor agreed there was enough to question Harmon and Jenkins. By nightfall, both men were in custody, Jenkins having broken down and confessed to his role in setting up the meeting where Harmon had killed Thomas Grayson. As Delilah and Preston prepared to return to the ranch the following morning, Charles Harrison approached them outside the hotel. Miss Grayson, he said, tipping his hat. I wanted to say goodbye before I returned to Philadelphia. Thank you for everything, Delilah said sincerely. For clearing my father's name, for helping bring his killer to justice. I'm grateful, Harrison smiled sadly. I only wish I'd found him sooner. Perhaps things would have turned out differently. Perhaps, Delilah agreed, but we can't change the past. No, we cannot. Harrison hesitated before continuing. Have you given any thought to what you'll do now? With your inheritance, you could go anywhere, do anything. The question caught Delilah off guard. She hadn't fully processed the implications of her sudden wealth, the freedom it offered. She glanced at Preston, who stood a few paces away, giving them privacy but remaining close enough that she could feel his presence like a physical comfort. I think, she said slowly, that I've already found where I belong. Harrison followed her gaze to Preston, understanding dawning in his eyes. I see, he smiled. Elizabeth would have been pleased. She always said that love was the greatest fortune one could possess. With a final handshake, Harrison departed, leaving Delilah standing with the bank draft that represented both her past and her future, clutched in her hand. Preston approached, his expression questioning. Ready to go home, home. The word held such power, such promise. Not a place, but a feeling one she had found with him. Yes, she said, tucking the envelope into her pocket. Let's go home. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about the revelations of the past 2 days. As they crested the final hill, the ranch spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Delilah felt a weight lift from her shoulders at the sight. It looks different somehow, she mused. Preston glanced at her. How so? Before, it was a sanctuary, a place where I could hide from what happened in Clifton. Now it feels like a beginning, he suggested. She smiled. Yes, exactly that. As they pulled up to the house, Martha burst through the front door, her expression a mixture of relief and excitement. Thank heavens you're back. I've been worried sick with all the news from town. She embraced Delilah fiercely. "Is it true what they're saying? That Harmon killed your father?" "It's true," Preston confirmed, helping Delilah down from the wagon. "And there's more to tell, but it can wait until we've had a chance to rest." Martha nodded, ushering them inside. "I've kept supper warm. You both look like you could use a good meal and a night's sleep." Later that evening, after recounting the full story to Martha, Delilah found herself alone with Preston on the porch. The night was cool, stars scattered across the vast desert sky like diamonds on velvet. "What will you do now?" Preston asked, echoing Harrison's earlier question. "With the inheritance, I mean." Delilah considered her answer carefully. "I've been thinking about that. $20,000 is more money than I ever imagined having." "You could go anywhere," Preston said, his voice carefully neutral. "Back east, perhaps. Start fresh where no one knows your past." She turned to face him fully. "Is that what you think I want?" "I think," he said slowly, "that you deserve every opportunity this money can provide, and I wouldn't blame you for wanting to leave all this behind." Delilah stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "Preston Abernathy, for a smart man, you can be remarkably dense sometimes." Surprise flickered across his face. "Meaning?" "Meaning that I have no intention of going anywhere." She held his gaze steadily. "Unless you want me to." Hope and uncertainty warred in his expression. "What I want," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "is for you to stay. Not as my employee, not as a charity case, but as—" He faltered. "As what?" she prompted gently. Preston took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "As my partner, my equal, my wife if you'll have me." The words, though hoped for, still took her breath away. "Are you asking me to marry you, Mr. Abernathy?" A smile touched his lips. "I believe I am, Miss Grayson, though I'm making a mess of it." Delilah laughed, joy bubbling up within her. "On the contrary, I think you're doing just fine." She squeezed his hands. "And yes, I'll marry you. Not because you saved me, but because you truly saw me when everyone else looked away." Preston drew her closer. "You know what I thought that day? When I saw you standing on that auction block." "What?" "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. And then I thought someone sold her as a lesson, but she looks like a blessing instead." Delilah reached up to trace the line of his jaw. "A blessing." "The greatest one I've ever received," he affirmed, lowering his head to capture her lips in a kiss that felt like a promise, like a future unfolding before them. When they parted, Delilah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What will we do with the money?" Preston's arms tightened around her. "That's your decision. It's your inheritance." "No," she said firmly, "it's ours. Everything I have, everything I am, I want to share it with you." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "The south pasture," he said finally, "the one that borders Harmon's land. I've always wanted to expand the ranch in that direction, add to the herd." "Then that's what we'll do," Delilah decided. "Build something together, something that will last." 3 months later, on a crisp October day, Delilah Grayson became Delilah Abernathy in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Martha had outdone herself decorating the house with autumn flowers and ribbons, and the ranch hands had constructed an arbor beneath which the couple exchanged their vows. Charles Harrison had returned from Philadelphia for the occasion, bringing with him a wedding gift, a journal that had belonged to Elizabeth, filled with poetry and pressed flowers from a time when she and Thomas Greenwood had dreamed of a future together. "To remember that even the most winding paths can lead to happiness," Harrison said as he presented it to Delilah. Elizabeth would have been overjoyed to see her Thomas's daughter find such love. The expansion of the Abernathy Ranch proceeded throughout the winter, with the purchase of the south pasture and additional cattle. By spring, they had begun construction on a new, larger house to accommodate the family they hoped to have. You ever regret it?" Preston asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the old house, watching the sunset paint the partially constructed frame of their new home in shades of gold and crimson. "Not using your inheritance to start a different life somewhere else?" Delilah, her hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach where their child grew, shook her head. "Never. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. Even with all the gossip in town," he pressed. "People still talk, you know." "Let them," she said serenely. "What do their words matter when we know the truth?" Preston's hand covered hers. "And what truth is that?" Delilah smiled, leaning into his embrace. "That sometimes the things that seem like our greatest trials lead us to our greatest blessings." She turned her face up to his. "That I was sold as a lesson, but you claimed me as a blessing instead." "The blessing was mine," Preston murmured against her lips. "It always has been." As the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that was now truly their own, Delilah thought of the winding path that had led her here, the grief and betrayal, the fear and uncertainty, all leading to this moment of perfect contentment. In the summer of 1879, Delilah gave birth to a son they named Thomas Preston Abernathy, a name that honored both the past and the future. As she cradled her newborn, with Preston looking on with pride and wonder, Delilah knew that the circle was complete. The legacy of pain her father had left behind had been transformed into something beautiful, a family built on love, trust, and second chances. By the time their son took his first steps across the polished wooden floors of their new home, the Abernathy Ranch had become the most prosperous in the territory. Preston's skill with cattle combined with Delilah's sharp business acumen, a talent she discovered she had inherited from both her father and the Harrisons, made them formidable partners in every sense of the word. 5 years after their wedding, with a daughter named Elizabeth Martha joining their family, Delilah stood on the porch of their home, watching Preston teach young Thomas to ride his first pony. Martha, her hair now completely silver but her spirit as strong as ever, sat in a rocking chair nearby, knitting a blanket for the baby Delilah carried beneath her heart, their third child, due with the spring. "Did you ever imagine this?" Martha asked, her needles clicking steadily. "That day when Preston brought you here, half frightened and uncertain of your future?" Delilah smiled, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Never in my wildest dreams. I was just grateful for a roof and the chance to work. And now look at you, mistress of the finest ranch in Arizona territory, mother to these beautiful children." Martha's eyes twinkled. "And you've done the impossible, made that stubborn man truly happy." "We've made each other happy," Delilah corrected gently. "That's the secret, I think. Finding someone who sees your value even when you've forgotten it yourself." As Thomas let out a whoop of delight, successfully guiding his pony in a small circle while Preston walked alongside, Delilah felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life they had built together. From the ashes of her father's mistakes and betrayals had risen something precious, and enduring a legacy of love that would carry forward through their children and beyond. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the familiar landscape in golden light. Delilah thought of that terrible day on the auction block, of the despair that had threatened to consume her. How could she have known then that what seemed like the end would prove to be just the beginning? Preston looked up, catching her eye across the yard, and the love in his gaze still made her breath catch, even after all these years. He lifted their son from the pony's back and set him on his shoulders, carrying him toward the house as little Elizabeth toddled behind, her chubby hands reaching for her father's legs. "Papa, up!" the little girl demanded, and Preston obliged, somehow managing to carry both children as he approached the porch. "I think these young wranglers are ready for supper," he announced, his voice warm with pride. "They've worked up quite an appetite." Later that night, with the children tucked into their beds and the house quiet around them, Delilah and Preston sat together on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The vast desert sky spread above them, stars glittering like promises in the darkness. "Happy?" Preston asked, his voice a rumble beneath her ear. "Completely," she affirmed. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He placed his free hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath his palm. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve all this." "You saw value where others saw only profit," Delilah said simply. "You offered kindness when it wasn't required of you. You loved when you could have simply walked away." Preston's lips brushed her temple. "I couldn't have walked away from you if I'd tried." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of a love built on mutual respect and understanding, Delilah thought of how far they had come from that fateful day in Clifton. The whispers had eventually died down, replaced by a begrudging respect for what they had accomplished together. Even in town, they were now greeted with nods of acknowledgement rather than suspicious glances. The past could not be erased, but it had been transformed, woven into the tapestry of their shared life, each painful thread necessary for the beauty of the whole. "You know what today is?" Delilah asked suddenly. Preston considered for a moment. "Wednesday," she laughed softly. "It's exactly 7 years since you found me on that auction block." His arm tightened around her. "The best decision I ever made." "For both of us," she agreed, turning to meet his gaze in the moonlight. "From the darkest moment of my life came everything good that followed." Preston cupped her cheek in his palm. "That's the thing about darkness," he said softly. "It makes you appreciate the light all the more." As his lips found hers in a kiss as sweet and promising as their first, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that some souls were destined to find each other across auction blocks and cattle ranges, through betrayal and redemption, beyond past mistakes and future uncertainties. And in that knowledge was a peace that surpassed all understanding, a foundation upon which they would continue to build their life together, one day at a time, until the end of their days.